Hello and welcome back to Evangelize Me, the YouTube channel where you can learn about your faith. We are in the middle of a series called Preparing for the Advent, preparing for Christ's return. We have been working through a plan that has brought us to looking at Romans chapter 1. We kind of changed the schedule in the middle of this to kind of extend it a little so that we can have more time to look at how we respond to all the stuff that we've looked at. And I've referred to Romans chapter 1 many times through this class and decided that we really needed to take an in-depth look at it. And I'm glad that we did. I began recording this or preparing for it right around the midterm elections in 2022. And of course, now it's about a week later after the election, and it certainly didn't go the way that everyone was thinking. On election day and leading up to election day, we had predictions of a red wave or a red tsunami, red tidal waves, and all of these things. And it certainly didn't work out that way at all, which was really surprising because, in a midterm election, the sitting president, especially the first term, always loses a lot of seats in Congress, except for George W. Bush after 9/11. That's what you'd expect. And so just that all by itself would be enough, right? But you throw in the, 40-year high inflation and gas prices and parental rights and all of the other issues, then it seemed reasonable to think that Republicans would win by a landslide. But of course, they didn't, which was a surprise to a lot of people. And it was funny because I began preparing this class on Romans chapter 1 on election day. And I remember thinking, it's going to be hard for people to hear this, after such a great victory. Everybody's going to want to celebrate the change. And what I have to say, I think, actually explains why the election went the way that it did. And so when I got up Wednesday morning and saw the results, it was like, oh, that tells me where we are as a nation in this process. Because in Romans chapter 1, Paul lays out this this progression of events. I don't know, we've referred to as it was in the days of Noah, scripture where Jesus is telling people that the last days, that his second coming will be like it was in the days of Noah. And so when you go back and read that story, what you discover is that the scripture says before the flood that every intention of their heart was evil, right? And so out of all the people on the planet, only 8 people are saved in the ark, right? All the rest are swept away with the flood. And so you have to stop and think, it's like, wow, how do human beings living in communities, how could it possibly be that you'd get to the point where there would be so much violence and sexual perversion and anger and hatred that there wouldn't be like any possibility of redemption for them in this life? It's fascinating, right? And so you think, like, how does that happen? Because when Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so it's going to be again, it means that's what the Great Tribulation is going to look like, right? It means that people are going to become overall evil, right? The expression of the worst parts of humanity is going to find expression in the last days. How do we do that? How do we get to that point as a culture? And that's what Paul explains in Romans chapter 1. So let's jump right in there. We're going to begin in verse 18. And that begins with a phrase that we have to stop. But even before we hardly read it, right? It says the wrath of God. And so you have to stop there and say, okay, well, wrath of God. Now, I grew up with a really angry parent, and so I know what wrath looks like. It's out of control anger, unpredictability, unstable, not safe, all of those phrases and adjectives that we would use for someone whose anger is out of control, right? And of course, when we talk about the wrath of God, that is not what we're talking about at all. Because we know that the scriptures say Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We know that God is unchanging. That's what makes him so safe. He doesn't wake up in a bad mood, right? He doesn't suddenly lose his temper because I've sinned. But that, what this is saying is that this unchangeable God has a consistent and permanent response towards evil and sin, right? It is always his response to sin. And the closest that we could use to describe it, because it's so utterly different than our human anger, which is usually rooted in sin, right? And obviously God's is not rooted in sin. The closest we can come to that is like it's some sort of anger, right? But it's not human anger. It is that's just the way that our puny little created minds could frame it so that we could have an understanding of it to some degree, probably a little degree, right? And so this phrase, the wrath of God, doesn't mean that God is out of control, angry, or having a fit, or any of those things. It just means that God always has the same response to sin and to death and to evil and to wickedness. Always. And so the wrath of God is indeed being revealed from heaven against every impiety and wickedness of those who suppress the truth by their wickedness. So the wrath of God is indeed being revealed. And you notice that that's in the current text, right? It's a current, what's that word? Tense. There we go. It's in the current tense, so it's being revealed right now, which is kind of interesting because usually when I think of the wrath of God, I think like fire and brimstone, or the people who rebelled against Moses and the ground opened up and swallowed them, those types of things. But it's being revealed right now, already in this time, against every impiety and wickedness. And it's being expressed to those who, or towards those who suppress the truth. Now, suppression is an active verb, right? It's not a passive thing. It's not done something in ignorance. It's something that is actively being done. So suppressing the truth, if they're not doing it by accident, they're doing it intentionally to hide or bury the truth. So when I think about suppress, I think, the image that comes to mind is being in a pool and having one of those, little plastic kickballs and trying to hold it underwater, right? The amount of energy and intentionality and focus it takes to keep that, because what it wants to do is float, right? What it wants to do is to be, what truth wants to do is to be manifested. And so this idea of suppressing, burying, covering, hiding the truth is an active process with this wickedness. Very interesting. And of course, what they're suppressing is the truth. And remember, we've talked about and looked at the scriptures that talk about the last days, there being a deception, right? That is one of the marks of the last time, is lies being spread and believed on a large scale basis. Okay? All right, so next verse. For what can be known about God is evident to them, because God has made it evident to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes and eternal power and divinity have been able to be understood and perceived in what he has made. So what Paul is arguing here is that knowing that there is a God is something that every single human being knows, right? You've heard the expression, there's no atheist in foxholes, right? The idea that when the rubber meets the road, that when life gets really difficult, or when we're in a lot of pain, or when we're in a lot of fear, then our hearts automatically turn towards God. That we know at some level of our being, we are hardwired to be spiritual. There's some fascinating brain studies about that, but we are hardwired to be spiritual beings. And so to convince us that there is nothing but this material world takes a suppression of that natural knowledge. And that natural knowledge comes, I think, innately through our conscience. And I mean, like, all you have to do is hang out with kids, right? I mean, even kids who aren't raised in religious circumstances, young children, you talk to 4 and 5-year-olds, they know that there's a God, right? They might not have ever been taught that there's a God. They might never ever, but if you engage them in a conversation, there's, in my experience, very few children who don't know that there's a God, right? So it's a natural inclination for us human beings, even though we're affected by sin. But then Paul is saying it's not just that, it's also the fact of creation, right? The beauty, the power, the goodness of creation, the design of creation, the intricacy of how everything is balanced and fits together and works together. Amazing and profound that through all the ages, even without modern scientific knowledge, which we'll come back to in a second, it's obvious that there is a creator. And it's interesting that he makes this assertion because, and he'll reaffirm this later, that human beings know that there's a creator because if you go back to ancient Greek philosophers who are, before Christ, they're not, they're not part of the Jewish system. They don't have any divine revelation, and yet Plato talked about a supreme being who must be good. Right, that he looked at the goodness in people and the goodness and beauty in creation and said, there has to be a supreme being that is goodness, right? Aristotle later on came up with the idea that, observing that nothing moves unless it's moved upon, came up with it. There must be an unmoved mover, right? There must be someone who started this whole process. That if we go back far enough, we will find the unmoved mover. So it's funny that these Greek philosophers, thousands of years ago, could rationally, without divine revelation, come to this conclusion, right? And of course, it's even more so now. When Darwin introduced his theory of the origin of species in 1859, if you've looked at the timeline that we did last week, and you looked at where the microscope was first invented, Darwin would have known that we were made up of cells, but to him they were basically little packets of fluid, right? Didn't know what cells were made of, or how they functioned, or any of those types of things. Now we know that they are packed full of micro machines, highly designed, engineered, well-balanced machines, complicated machines that handle all of these complex functions of keeping things in balance and neutralized, and production and quality control and transportation and communication and waste management. I mean, it's astounding what you would need for a single-celled organism, that it's literally mathematically impossible that these things evolved by accident, randomly, because there's simply not enough time, right? So now, in the modern age, we even know more now than they did for the last thousands of years about how complex and amazing creation is. And that's just one aspect. I mean, you could look at photosynthesis, you could look at, the eyeball, you could look at, there's tons of things to look at to realize, wow, this is just astounding, right? So, so when Paul says, as a result, in the next verse, as a result, they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not accord him glory as God or give him thanks. So he's saying this 2,000 years ago, right? And he's saying, listen, you know that there's a God, and you can tell that there's a God because where did all this stuff come from, right? And now in our modern age, we even more have no excuse. And so, of course, if you don't believe in a creator, then you're not going to acknowledge him as God or give him glory or thanks or honor him as God because, of course, you don't think he exists. And obviously, if you thought he existed, like if you were just left on your own and you came to the conclusion that there had to be a creator, then the natural response would be like, wow, he created me too, right? And so he deserves something from me. He deserves my honor, my obedience, my thanksgiving at the very least, right? And so, and this is a key verse. When they deny that there's a creator, instead they became vain in their reasoning, and their senseless minds were darkened. And so you think about this for a second. You think, okay, what Paul is saying in this verse is very profound because he's saying when you deny the creator who created everything with reason and purpose and design, if you deny him, then your understanding and your interaction with reality is now warped, right? Your capacity as a human being to think reasonably is now impaired, right? Because the creator and creation provides the context for what exists and why it exists and the purpose of its existence, and it gives definition to everything that exists. So if you throw out the creator, then you throw out the design and the purpose and the reason for all of this being here. And now you have to just make stuff up, right? And so they become vain in their reasoning, and their senseless minds are darkened. Paul also talks about darkened minds in Ephesians, right? And he talks in another place about them having a veil over their minds and their eyes so that they can't see. So this idea that if you don't believe in a creator, it affects you and your rationality, your human capacity to perceive things correctly is profoundly important. So he goes on. While claiming to be wise, they become fools. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of an image of mortal man, or of birds, or four-legged animals, or of snakes. So you want to stop there and you just think, okay, obviously he's talking about idolatry. If you don't serve the one true God, then you're going to serve something, right? And whatever you serve as a God, whatever you make most important in your life becomes your idol, right? And so your idol could be wealth, it could be honor, it could be, pleasure. Yeah, and so you think, okay, so we don't make statues and bow down and worship them anymore, but we still have idols. And so this idea that we exchange a relationship with the living, all-powerful, all-loving God who created us to our human pleasure or human wealth or human honor is foolish. And so Paul says, therefore, right, because of that, because they denied the Creator and became idolatrous, therefore God handed them over. Now, this is a phrase that we find 3 times in the book of Romans. This is the judgment, the wrath of God that is being revealed, that he said in verse 18. He's showing us this is how the wrath of God is being revealed. It's being revealed when God hands them over. And what does he hand them over to? Impurity through the lusts of their hearts, for the mutual degradation of their bodies. He hands them over to the lusts of our hearts. Remember, James says we're tempted to sin because of our evil hearts, the evil desires of our hearts. And so what this says to me is that, like, there's a grace that protects us from being the worst version of ourselves, right? There's a grace that keeps us from making the worst decisions, right? And part of that grace comes to us through our culture. Some of it comes to us through our family life. Some of it comes to us through our conscience, and some of it is supernatural grace of protecting us. And so basically the idea here is that God removes that grace so that the evil that's in our hearts now finds a freedom to be expressed, right? And so this sexual giving over of yourself, and you notice it's the degradation of their body, so it's the lust, the sexual lusts of their hearts. Now, I find this very interesting, because, you remember the timeline that we did last week. If you haven't watched that video, you should go back and check it out, because I think it's very powerful visual of where we are right now. But you remember, we went through the Supreme Court decisions, right? And yeah, actually, I'm going to back up even further. So Darwin writes The Origin of Species in 1859. 1925, you have the Scopes trial, which means it was just like a show trial to kind of bring public awareness to the debate that was going on. And so it took a long time for it to become established. But now in our culture, we have several generations. I mean, like, I'm an old man, right? And I was taught evolution. So this idea, right, that introduces there is no creator. The idea that says this all happened by accident through random change over a long period of time, kind of gave an opening, like, for human beings in the West that would have been unheard of, right? In any time since the fall of Rome, anyone who didn't believe in God was considered a fool, right? Like, you'd have to be stupid not to believe in God. And now that has completely reversed in academic circles, right? And in a large part of our culture. So the idea becomes, now if you believe in God, you're stupid. You're uneducated. Like, you should have, gone to college so that you wouldn't have to believe those old fairy tales. And so you have this huge transition. And it's almost like Darwin's theory provided like an accent ramp for people to be able to, like, okay, now I don't have to believe in God because, that creator thing was getting in the way. Now that we have this theory, we can get rid of God, right? And so we have this whole generation after generation now, trained. And when I say trained, I mean every biology book, every textbook, every story about any kind of animals, any documentary, any nature story. I'm amazed reading stories to my grandchildren about animals, and they'll sneak it in there. It's like, isn't it amazing how this evolved? It's like, well, isn't it amazing how it's designed, right? And so this indoctrination takes place all the way through. It's interesting. I'm not sure if it was Einstein, but some famous scientist said, you can learn just enough science to not believe in God. But if you really learn a lot of science, you discover how real God is, right? And so this idea that we introduce this idea at a very young age, we indoctrinate it to them all the way through. And so that people become convinced it's true without ever really looking into it. This whole idea of the origin of life, usually in textbooks, even college textbooks today, there's an experiment that they did, right, where they produced some proteins, strings of amino acids using chemicals and electricity, and they said, this is probably how it happened. This is how the origin of life happened. But that experiment was thrown out and disproved years and years ago. And yet, if you look at a brand new textbook published this year, you'll no doubt find that experiment in there. Isn't that amazing? what you'll find in the experiment, is that they used really high concentrations of chemicals that aren't found in nature, right? And they're industrially produced chemicals at high concentrations and mixed in such a way under pristine laboratory conditions with the exclusion of other atmospheric or things that would be found in nature. I mean, like, it's like this is as far from nature as you could possibly get. So this is an impossible explanation for the origin of life. And yet, you still find it in every biology textbook that I have seen. See, this is the deception, right? Whether you believe in like an old earth or a new earth, whether you believe it took thousands of years, it doesn't matter. The question is, was it random and by accident, or was it directed by intelligence? And if it's directed by intelligence, and there's proof that it's directed by intelligence by the engineering and design and the intricacy and the balance, then you have to come to the conclusion like there's some intelligence behind this, right? So anyway, God gives them over to the lusts of their hearts. So you think about the progression that we did last week with the Supreme Court decisions. And we said in 1962, the Supreme Court decided that you shouldn't pray in school, right? In 1965, they said birth control was legal. Up until that point, of course, it had been illegal for the most part. And then, of course, after that decision, obviously, there's, if you're being trained that you're just an animal and now you don't have to worry about getting pregnant, there's the sexual revolution in the 60s, right? It was shocking. It was crazy. And yet it's just part of our culture now. You can sleep with whoever you want to, consenting adults, live with people, don't live with people, live with people before you get married. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, we don't even think about it anymore because it's so common. But that wasn't very long ago, right? And then, of course, birth control didn't always work, so now we need abortion to get rid of the babies that are conceived because of all the sex that's going on. So you think, you put that all together and you say, wait a minute, like, so there's this denying of the Creator on a large scale in a society, and the very next thing that happens is this sexual revolution. It's like, well, that's not a coincidence, right? Paul is saying that is the natural result. That is the judgment of God coming upon a society. The judgment of God coming upon a society is when God turns them over to the lusts of their hearts. Do you see the connection I'm making here? That it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It's not just something that happened randomly, but that we as a nation are already entered, have already entered into the judgment of God. So Paul goes on, he says, they exchanged the truth of God, the truth of the reality of who God is, for a lie, and revered and worshipped the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. Amen. Therefore, because they exchanged the truth for a lie, therefore, God handed them over. What's he hand them over to this time? God hands them over to degrading passions. Their females exchanged natural relations for unnatural. The males likewise gave up natural relations with females and burned with lust for one another. Males did shameful things with males and thus received in their own persons the due penalty for their perversity. Wow, okay, so if you deny that God's a creator, then you get turned over to your sexual lusts. And then if you still don't repent, then you get turned over to degrading passions. Now, you notice I said, if you don't repent, because I think that with each stage of this, there's an opportunity. There's a mercy. Where are my hands with relation to the, there's a mercy mixed in with God's judgment, right? I have an analogy that I use. It might not be the best one. I don't know. But I started smoking pot when I was in 8th grade. By the time I was a sophomore, I was smoking every day, before school, at lunchtime, after school. It was a full-fledged, my nickname was Stones in high school. And so that's a kind of an expensive habit to have. And so I can remember a friend of mine coming up with this idea that, if we started selling, then we not only would get our pot for free, but we'd also make money, right? And so, so it was like this desire. And so with each time that you get turned over, you have a new opportunity to repent. Like, okay, so the very first time that I smoked pot, it was just like, oh my gosh, this is risky. I shouldn't be doing this. My parents would kill me if they knew. And yet, after a while, it just becomes like, not a big deal. I know how to keep it a secret. I'm not going to get caught. I believe all these things, right? So now it's sort of like, okay, let's take it. And it's almost like God turns you over. It's like, okay, it's an exercise of our free will, right? Like, okay, if that's the life you want, then go ahead and have it, right? And so we go to the next level. The next level for me would have been like, okay, I'm going to start selling drugs. And so he and I go to this house, and I could probably show you the house in Caribou, Maine, that we went to. It was on the wrong side of the tracks, I'll tell you that. And we went in, and there were guns, and there was lots of money, and there were some pretty sketchy characters there, and so we talked about, like, how much would a pound cost, and like, how much could we sell it for, and what's it look like, and how soon could we get it, and how much money do we need, and it was like making a business deal. And so I went home that night, and the very next morning I get up, and the newspaper's on the kitchen table. And you know how when there's a crime, they take a picture of the house from outside. And so imagine my surprise when I get up and I look, and it's like, wow, that's the house I was at last night. And there had been a drug deal that went bad after we left, and the guy that we had talked to had gotten murdered, which is big news in Caribou, Maine, of course. And I can remember the very first thought I thought was, my fingerprints are in that house, right? And it was just like this sudden, like, oh my gosh, like, what the heck am I doing? This is stupid. Like, you go to jail for this stuff. You're risking your life. And there was a change in me. Now, I still had a choice. I could have thought, well, crap, now I got to find a new dealer, right? But because of that moment, I had a moment of grace where I could say, oh gosh, I don't want to continue down this path, right? Because that path would lead to, like, more addictive drugs, harder drugs, right? Worse addictions. It would have been easy to choose that path. And so that's why I say, like, each one of these, when God turns you over, and you take it to the next level, there's this new opportunity of, like, wow, what's going on with me? Like, why am I doing this, right? So the next level is homosexuality. Now, it's fascinating to me that after the sexual revolution and the adoption of abortion, then the next significant moral decision that the Supreme Court makes is in 2005. I think I didn't look up the date before I started recording this, when the Supreme Court legalized homosexual activity. Right? Remember, in 1962, it was illegal in all 50 states. The year that they took prayer out of school, homosexuality is illegal in all 50 states, and it's considered a psychiatric disorder, a psychosocial, a sociopathic disorder. Now, 2005 says, the Supreme Court says, oh no, like, it's fine. Just anybody can do anything they want, right? In the privacy of their homes. And then in 2015 says same-sex unions are legalized clear across the country, regardless of what any state would want. And again, I just want to say, like, okay, you deny the Creator, you get turned over to lust, you continue on that path, you get turned over to homosexuality. So you have this progression, which we can see in American history, right? We can see it in our own culture. You wonder how Noah's culture gets to be where it is. We're watching it. Okay, let's continue. Paul continues. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, right? So they have another opportunity to acknowledge God. They didn't do it. So God hands them over. So here's that handing over again. This is the third time, the third and final time. And this time, God hands them over to their undiscerning mind to do what is improper. So you think about what discernment means. Like discernment means this process where you narrow down the options to come to a knowledge of the truth, right? So we use it a lot when we talk about discerning your vocation. So you look at like, what are your options? Are you going to get married? Are you going to pursue some sort of religious career? I mean, like the idea of like searching your heart and trying to discover what the truth is about this situation. So if you have an undiscerning mind, it means you can't perceive the truth, right? You're not even trying to determine the truth. And so Paul makes this list. This isn't the only time he makes a list. He makes a list when he's writing Timothy. That list is a little shorter, but includes some of the same things. He makes a list, I think, in Ephesians. There's several places where he does this. This is this lengthy and I would say graphic description that he gives. So he says, after they're handed over to their undiscerning minds, they are filled with every form of wickedness, evil, greed, malice, full of envy and murder and rivalry and treachery and spite. They are gossips and scandal mongers, and they hate God. Now, you just pause for a second and you say, okay, if someone was filled with greed, that would be really ugly, right? That would be just like awful. Or if they were filled with envy, right? Or if they were filled with spite or treachery. I mean, like any one of these things would make for a really ugly human life. And a very awful human life, too, as you experience it. And Paul says, no, they are filled with every form of wickedness and evil and greed and malice, full of envy, murder, rivalry, treachery, and spite. He goes on, he says, they are insolent and haughty and boastful, ingenious in their wickedness. One translation says, they create new ways to be evil, right? Rebellious towards their parents. They are senseless and faithless and heartless and ruthless. So that is quite a description, right? And so you combine this. This is the, what was the phrase that he just used? Undiscerning mind goes along with that. Vain in their reasoning and darkened mind, right? And so this description that Paul is coming up with is that these people are detached from reason, they're detached from reality, they're no longer able to even come to a knowledge of what is true. They're not even being rational anymore, which makes perfect sense in our culture, right? Because now, after we've gone through our sexual revolution, our homosexual revolution, now we've entered into this brand new reality where men can get pregnant, where boys can be girls and girls can be boys, right? Where it's just like, this isn't even close to being something real, and it's shocking for us and confusing for us, and yet the answer is right here, written 2,000 years ago by the Apostle Paul when he says, listen, this is what happens when you deny God as the Creator. This is what happens. This is the progression of events. And we can look at our culture today and say, oh my gosh, we've already gone through step 1. We've already gone through step 2. We are already at step 3. Just to give you just a simple, almost silly example of this. You've probably had somebody come to your door and knock on your door, like especially during campaign season. Usually they're Democrats, because Democrats are better at campaigning than Republicans, which is pretty evident in this last election. So they'll knock on the door, and the first thing I'll say is like, "Well, are you pro-choice?" And they'll say yes, and I'll say, "Well, listen, I believe that at the moment of conception, that the DNA that's united there is this is the creation of this unique, amazing, eternal human being, like has never existed before and will never again exist. And from that second of conception, that is a human being that deserves to live. And so there is no way I could ever vote for you, right?" And then I say, like, "Have a nice day, get off my property, whatever, but I can just tell them that, right?" So a couple of months ago, there was a referendum going on in Kansas, and this high school girl, well, I don't know if she's high school, it's a teenager, that's what so a teenager is canvassing. She has to be 18, I would guess, because they included her name in the article. But she looked like she was 16, she's a teenager. She goes up to this house, knocks on the door, says, "I'm canvassing for this referendum." The person in the house starts punching her. She has to run away. She has to go to the hospital. She's lightheaded and bruised. What is that, right? I mean, that's just crazy. That's just crazy. What is it? Full of envy, murder, rivalry, treachery, spite. Ruthless, heartless. And all you have to do, every day we are accosted by the news of school shootings and random shootings and people being shoved in front of trains and subways. It's just like, wow, oh my gosh, we are living in this chapter of Romans in this place, right? We are on this path already. So we shouldn't be surprised. In fact, I would propose to you that we should be preparing for worse things to come, because that's the idea, right? Is that the judgment of God is bringing about this place. I don't know if it's the Great Tribulation or not. It might just be the decline and fall of the Western world, right? There's been plenty of very perverse empires. The Babylonian Empire was, horribly perverse, orgies in the street type of thing. They got destroyed. The Roman Empire, once it conquered everywhere and gets rich and opulent and lazy, and then they became a very perverted society, and they get destroyed. It could just be this is the end of the Western world. But seeing as how we have exported our evilness, right? We are the world's largest exporter of pornography. We are the largest proponent of LGBT rights around the world. We have literally forced countries to change their laws based on, if you don't change your laws, we're not going to give you American aid, so that they would legalize actions that their people don't agree with, right? But because we're America, we can do that. And so we've exported this evil all over the world. And so that makes me wonder, is this just the fall of the Western Empire, or is it the beginning of something bigger? I have no idea. So Paul goes on, he says, although they know, and this is an interesting phrase, they know the just decree of God that all who practice such things deserve death. In other words, they're not doing this in ignorance, right? They're doing it. They know that they are giving themselves over to anger and malice and sin. They not only continue to do them, but give approval to those who practice them. After the homosexual revolution, there was this effort to make same-sex attracted people feel normal. And so we had a pride day, and then it wasn't just like making them feel normal, but to affirm their behavior, positively affirm it. And so now we have a Pride Month, and now we have corporations where if you don't toe the line of accepting this lifestyle, then you lose your job. Remember last week we talked about that at some point, what you believe is going to affect your ability to interact with the economic system, right? The mark of the beast. They won't be able to buy or sell. And we looked at some modern day examples of how that might work. That's directly related to this Romans chapter 1. So just to review this idea that God, the wrath of God is being revealed. It's being revealed because God turns people over, right? That's the judgment. He turns them over to the lusts of their heart. He turns them over to dishonorable passions. He turns them over to undiscerning minds. And when we look at our history in the United States in these last 60 years, with whole generations being taught that there is no creator, and then you look at where we have gone with the sexual revolution and casual sex, and then you look at the whole homosexual movement being accepted and promoted and now being required to be affirmed, and then we come to the undiscerning minds where things just don't even make sense anymore. If you ask me, Romans 1 tells us exactly where we are in this process. We shouldn't be surprised. I started out talking about the election. How's this related to the election? Well, given history and economics, the Republicans should have won pretty handily last week. But they didn't. Because people voted, the people who voted and elected people are functioning with undiscerning minds. They're functioning in a sense of darkness and in a vanity of their reasoning. It's not going to get any better. But that's not all the news that there is. So for the last couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, I've basically been sharing with you the bad news, right? The bad news is that things get really ugly before Christ returns. The bad news is that we are living right in the midst of it and are further along in it than even I would have guessed just a few weeks ago, right? But we have some good news. And for the next 4 weeks, we're extending the class by 4 weeks. The next 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at these truths, the good news that counteracts these things. It's the news, the truths, I should say, that we need to know and embrace and establish into the very bottoms of our hearts so that we can not just survive what's coming down the pike, but that we can stand. That's the word that Paul uses in Ephesians. Having done all, to stand. Talking about spiritual warfare. So next week is in the Catholic tradition, we're going to be celebrating the feast of Christ the King, and so it's appropriate for us to look at what does it mean that Christ is King? What does it mean that Christ is victorious over sin and death? That's next week, and I hope you'll join me. God bless you. Thanks for watching.